I don't think the failure of the war is the problem. People die in war. I think the problem is the intent. And Imran touched on it. People don't believe the intentions of the British or the Allies in Iraq. And I don't actually think they feel it's a war on Islam so much as they feel that the intentions were primarily related to greed and that Islam can be the savior. From those I've spoken to, from my analysis of what's been happening, it's not so much a war on Islam because these people are not, they're certainly not as educated as they could be or should be if we're going to try and prevent this from spreading, but they can see that this is political and economic and not some ideological or theologically motivated attack. But ultimately, if you don't believe the people who are supposed to be representing you, and they haven't done much for you domestically, because the Pakistani communities in Britain are not thriving, then you feel that you need a savior. And when it's offered by way of certain outspoken clerics who propose a unity and a jihad that can not only save the Muslims, but save the world and we will spread our vision, feeling that you might be a savior is, I mean, we talked previously about happiness. It somehow brings about that feeling of, I can be great and I will, and there's a long-term view here. It doesn't matter, they'll think I'm terrorist now, but ultimately I'll show them that I'm taking away the greed of this government that is both demoralizing people in Britain by ignoring their protests and by going into Iraq and not caring about the casualties because their intention, if we genuinely believe their intention was to overthrow a tyrant and for things to be better in Iraq, we could forgive them their failure. I genuinely believe that we could forgive them their failure. But there are a lot of countries in that area that have dictators, and a lot of countries in that area that have human rights issues. But they picked on Iraq at a time where, don't know if you want to call this cynical, but at a time where a former agent of the West seemingly had decided to go alone and do what he wanted in that country. And many believe that this is the main motivation, because you have loads of other leaders in the area. So it's very much, well, you raise a tyrant, you support him for years, and then, and again, there's certainly no debatable, let's say this is arguable or debatable, but there is a strong political feeling that you raised him, you brought him about, you made him the strong man he was, you left him for decades to rule. Why now did you decide to get rid of him? And why him when many of his neighbours have similar regimes? So that's why there's no belief in the intent.
The problem with that analysis is that, as I think Louise said, that a lot of these terrorist attacks were planned long before the war in Iraq. A lot of people were converted to the armed struggle by the experience of Bosnian Muslims, for example. So even if in some way you could do what you're asking and go back and somehow get the Muslim community to somehow trust the government about Iraq, Iraq isn't the cause. So I'm not really sure how your analysis stands up.
Well, things certainly got worse in terms of Islamist extremism, and also when you speak about Islam, at one point you said that the Muslim community, how they can take care of these extremists and bring them more to the center. I don't think it's, generally, when it comes to perception, I say that it is a community's responsibility to fix its own perception. But I think when it comes to Islamist extremists, they need to be dealt with separate to Islam or Muslims by the government. So it's, as a Muslim, for want of a better word, a moderate Muslim, it is my responsibility to encourage the people of Britain and the media to understand that I am not the same as these Islamist extremists. But ultimately, those people are terrorists who use Islam as an excuse, maybe even a motivator. they are not me. So my responsibility is solely to me or people who have my view to let people understand that this is my Islam or this is my personal belief. But in terms of strategy, I think we have to strategize. These are terrorists. They're using Islam as an excuse, but they are terrorists, just like there are terrorists of other religions. But the reason Muslim terrorists get the whole Islam name is because they put it on themselves. Whereas a Christian or Jewish terrorist doesn't say, I'm doing it in the name of God and Christianity. This group does. Which causes a problem for mainstream Muslims, but I would hope that the government or legislators see that these are to be dealt with as terrorists and not as Muslims with terrorists.
Is it possible for forces outside this community to prevent the recruitment of terrorists, or is it actually for this community to, in a sense, take the lead in organising structured organisations, whatever it is, to actually isolate these people and prevent them using the name of Islam for acts which are obviously against the teaching of that religion?
I make 2 points. One, in terms of the role of government, and I'm not talking here about the obvious responsibilities around security and so on, and it's a very good thing that the budget of MI5 has been doubled and probably should be tripled or quadrupled, I think. But what governments can do is stop promoting Islamists. Just stop. Just stop bringing people onto panels, inviting them into prestigious venues, standing alongside them and presenting them as representatives of the community when in fact they have faction fought their way to supremacy over a period of the last 20 years, and they don't represent the majority of British Muslims, but they've managed to secrete themselves inside the Muslim Council of Britain, for instance, where the previous leader said it would possibly be too good for Salman Rushdie to be killed, and he boycotted Holocaust Memorial Day and so on. The current leader is, by and large, a representative of Maududist Jamaati Islami people. Yet they are presented by the government repeatedly as authoritative representative figures. I think that undermines all those people who are worried about that kind of extremism and who would seek to build an alternative to it. So I think government can do something very simple in that regard.
Well,
just make one other point
can you
about...
come back on that and come to the second point in a moment? Just let's follow that through. So what do we have then? We have a list of prescribed organisations that we didn't deal with.
No, I'm honestly about
or
prescribed organisations. I'm saying governments make decisions when they put working parties together. Governments make decisions when they decide, what status to give people in terms of how they relate to them and so on. I'm not saying anyone should be, cast out. I'm just saying you've got to think a lot more carefully about who are we choosing to promote in that way.
So, your second point.
Changes it. If you look at what we need is cultural change. If you look in the last 30 years in Britain, when has cultural change been achieved around an issue? That issue could be women's role in society, or it could be our attitudes towards gay people and lesbians and so on, or it could be green issues. What do you find when cultural change is taking place? You always find a social movement. And that social movement is a cluster of activism, writing, intellectual activity, representatives in Parliament, and these will feed off each other over time to create a new consensus. At the moment, I think what we lack, which is what I think is so interesting about the organisation that you're from in terms of Muslims for Secular Democracy, is we lack that kind of network. We lack that social movement of moderates who are organised, because when you read in detail the activities of the Islamist groups, they are 24/7 activists. They are organising in very deliberate ways to take over mosques, to take over community centres, to take over schools and so on, with their ideas. And they're very politicised and very active and very organised. And it's, at the moment, we lack, I think, a social movement, not an organisation of the high, just a network of people who have some sense of what they're doing, which is, we're going to fight back against this. And some of us are in intellectual fields, some of us are in the mosques and so on, some of us are organising solidarity work with women in Iran, but some kind of an identity of bringing together of a new kind of social movement, a new kind of network that says, we've been behind in the game for 20 years now, and we need to get into the game, and we really need to take these people on and get our arguments over.